Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really diving into something that, well, it touches pretty much everything digital in our lives, and maybe even deeper, our sense of what the future holds, which feels a bit shaky these days, right?
It definitely does.
The digital world, it's given us so much connection, information, you name it, but it's also brought these new kinds of worries.
Absolutely.
And the book we're digging into today really puts those worries front and center. It's Shoshana Zuboff's really important book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism.
Yeah, and our goal here is to unpack Zuboff's main argument, which is honestly pretty chilling when you get into it. She argues this isn't just about, the latest cool tech or apps.
Right. Not just gadgets.
No.
Yeah.
It's a whole new, pretty aggressive form of capitalism.
Yeah.
One that's fundamentally changing how we think about knowledge, power, authority, everything. So we're going to break down how our everyday clicks, searches, even just walking around now, how that's all being turned into, well, raw material for someone else's profit, and what that really means for, your own freedom and where society might be heading.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning, because it really feels like this whole thing kind of crept up on us. We hear the term surveillance capitalism thrown around a lot now, but what is it exactly? And how did it even start?
Yeah, that's the crucial starting point. It's really important to get that it's not just, say, faster internet or smarter phones. Zuboff calls it a logic in action. She even calls it a rogue capitalism.
Rogue, wow.
Yeah, because it cleverly took advantage of some specific things happening historically. And at its core is this idea she calls behavioral surplus.
Behavioral, okay.
Right. And this isn't just any data, it's the extra stuff. The information we generate that goes beyond what's needed for a service to actually work. Think about Google way back.
Yeah.
They were under huge pressure from investors, right? Needed a new way to make money besides just making search better. And their big secret discovery, the game changer, was realizing that this data exhaust.
Data exhaust, like the digital fumes we leave behind.
Exactly. All that extra stuff we generate online. They found it could be used to make incredibly accurate predictions about us, about our behavior. And that became the raw material for a completely new kind of market.
That's a really critical difference. So Google started out, you're saying, by using our data just to improve search for us, treating us as the ends, right?
Pretty much, yeah. The value created by our data was initially consumed to make the service better.
But then there was a shift. How did they pivot to grabbing more data than they needed? How did that extra stuff become this zero-cost asset for some other market we didn't even know about?
Exactly. That surplus data wasn't being plowed back into making your experience better anymore. It got diverted, shunted off into this very profitable market exchange. But, this didn't just happen out of the blue.
Right. You mentioned historical conditions.
Yes. Zuboff points to this collision of two really big societal shifts. One was this long-term move, happening over centuries, really, towards more individual expression, more personal choice. She calls it the second modernity.
Okay, like our desire for things that feel unique to us, that really get us, like maybe why Apple was so successful early on.
Precisely that kind of thing. And the other huge force was the rise of, well, what people often call neoliberalism, starting around the mid-'70s.
Right, the focus on free markets, deregulation.
Exactly. An economic mindset pushing for, radical market freedom, less government oversight. This led to this intense focus on maximizing shareholder value. That became like the main goal, the objective function for companies. By the time we hit the 2000s, you saw fewer big public companies, this whole cult of the entrepreneur taking off. And you had economists like Thomas Piketty pointing out this RG thing.
Where capital grows faster than the economy.
Yeah, basically showing how the people with money gained massive political clout. They could literally fund political changes to protect their ability to make more money. It created this really fertile ground for surveillance capitalism to sprout.
So these companies are emerging from that environment. They didn't just find this space, they actively claimed it. How did they manage to operate so freely, almost like they were above the law in those early days?
You nailed it. They basically put down roots in what Zuboff calls a lawless space. First, just through sheer corporate power. The Google founders, for instance, kept tight dynastic control.
Right.
And you had their CEO at the time, Eric Schmidt, kind of casually saying things like, the reality is that search engines retain this information, almost framing it as just how things are. A technical fact, not a choice.
Yeah, like it's inevitable, not a business strategy.
Exactly. Second, they really leaned into this cyber libertarian idea. and they use broad, maybe too broad interpretations of things like First Amendment rights. Well, essentially trying to argue that corporate actions, like scraping up data, were a form of speech, and therefore protected from government oversight. It's a pretty slick legal move, actually.
Wow.
And third, and this is maybe the most unsettling part, they found cover because of specific historical events. Post 9/11, the intelligence community suddenly became very interested in analyzing behavior, predicting threats, using this kind of data.
So the government actually saw potential value in this data exhaust that Google had stumbled upon. That created a sort of unlikely alliance.
That's exactly what Zuboff calls it, an elective affinity, a kind of mutual attraction, a shared interest between the state needing intelligence and these private companies sitting on this behavioral goldmine.
Yeah.
And that partnership really shielded these early surveillance capitalists from too much scrutiny while they were growing fast, allowed them to really take root in the shadows.
That paints a picture and a pretty bold, maybe even sneaky start. But, for people who are skeptical, or maybe for the companies themselves, how do they frame this? Surely they don't call it simple robbery. And can you give us some really concrete examples of how this actually played out?
Right. They definitely don't call it robbery. They frame it as, we give you free services, you give us data, or this is necessary for innovation, for personalization. But Zuboff's point is that the consent part is often buried or misleading. It's about taking data that isn't really freely given or where the terms are incredibly complex.
Like those 1,000-page terms of service nobody reads.
Exactly. That's part of what she calls the dispossession cycle. They make an incursion, then they deny what they're doing, use misdirection, and finally adapt when they get caught. Take the Nest thermostat.
The smart thermostat.
Yeah. Seems simple, right? Yeah. But Zuboff points out, understanding the privacy implications could mean reading, like nearly 1,000 so-called contracts. Your very sensitive household data when you're home, when you're away, gets shared for predictive analyses and sales to other unspecified parties. And Nest kind of washes its hands of the security risks. That's an incursion without real consent.
Okay, that's one. What else?
Then there's Google Street View. Remember when that launched back in 2007?
Vaguely, yeah. Driving car, taking pictures of streets.
Right. But Zuboff calls that simple robbery. Google just took what it wanted, images of public spaces, private homes, and, crucially, they also vacuumed up unsecured Wi-Fi data as those cars drove by.
They took Wi-Fi data, too. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. The FCC tried to investigate. Google dragged its feet, got fined eventually. But the engineer at the center of the Wi-Fi part, a guy named Marius Milner, described as a celebrated hacker. He stayed employed at Google. That's the denial and adaptation phase.
And the famous Facebook like button? That seemed so harmless at first, just a way to share things.
That's a perfect example of misdirection. The like button was presented as just a simple communication tool. But it was engineered from the start to capture continuous behavioral surplus.
How?
It installed tracking cookies, even on people who weren't Facebook members, just if they visited a website with the button. Zuckerberg initially tried to brush off concerns, calling the tracking a bug.
Right, I remember that.
But it quickly became obvious, as Zuboff says, the bug was a feature. This constant tracking fueled Facebook's explosive growth. Their ad revenue, which is almost all their revenue, depends on it.
So that success just attracted more companies into the same game.
Absolutely. It created this expanding competition. Microsoft jumped in, wanting to fuel ambient intelligence with its own data harvesting. Their assistant, Cortana, literally says things like, I know so much about you, I can see patterns that you can't see.
Kind of creepy when you put it that way.
A little, yeah. And it wasn't just tech giants. Even your cable and phone companies wanted a piece of the action. Verizon bought AOL specifically for its ad tech. The goal was, to out Facebook or out Google.
Wow.
Which makes it less surprising, maybe, that Congress later rolled back broadband privacy rules. The argument used was that requiring genuine consent would strike a serious blow to the foundational mechanisms of the new capitalism. They basically admitted the system relies on not getting clear consent.
So the system itself fought back against transparency.
In a way, yes. And finally, you see this evolving into surveillance as a service, SVAS.
What's that?
Think of companies like HiQ. They scrape employee data from places like LinkedIn to predict flight risk for companies basically telling your boss if they think you might quit.
Seriously? Based on public profiles?
Yep. Or these new app-based lenders, they might look at like 10,000 signals from your smartphone behavior to decide if you're creditworthy. Things like how often you charge your phone, who you text, where you travel.
That seems incredibly intrusive.
They'd say they really understand the daily life of these customers. But ultimately, it's about squeezing value out of your everyday, often unconscious behavior.
Okay, this is a lot. It really feels like it's shifting from just predicting what we might click on or buy to actually trying to, well, shape what we do, tune our behavior maybe. Is that where this is heading?
That is absolutely the next stage. Zuboff calls it the prediction imperative. It's this drive for total certainty. Eric Schmidt, again, had this vision where the internet will disappear. It will be part of your presence all the time.
Part of a presence.
Yeah, like imagine you walk into a room and the room is dynamic. It anticipates you, responds to you, maybe even guides you. This push for total knowledge includes mining what they call dark data.
Dark data. Sounds ominous.
It's the unknown unknown. Everything the Internet of Things can potentially capture, from a sensor in the soil to your car to, as one proponent chillingly imagined, your liver. The goal isn't just to know what you did, but to know everything, to predict with certainty.
That is quite a vision and a bit unnerving. So how does this hunger for certainty, for profit, actually show up in the real world? How does it start informing reality, as you put it?
It leads to what Zuboff calls the rendition of reality, basically translating every physical space, every action, everything into data. Take the smart home,
Okay.
that Roomba vacuum cleaner. Turns out, some versions were mapping your home's floor plan and the data. It could be sold to companies like Google, Amazon, Apple.
Selling my floor plan? Seriously?
Yep. Or consider sleep number beds. They collect biometric data, how you move, your heart rate, respiration, even audio data.
Audio, like listening.
Potentially, yes. And their privacy policies. They often have this twist Zuboff calls a coercive requerimiento. It's named after this old Spanish decree forcing submission. Here, it means give us your data, or key features the product won't work.
So you're kind of forced to agree if you want the thing you paid for.
Exactly. It's coercion disguised as choice. And they often reserve the right to keep and exploit your data, even if you close your account.
Wow. That historical comparison really hits hard. So it's not just our homes, but our actual bodies being turned into data sources.
Absolutely. That's body rendition.
Yeah.
It starts simply with your phone's location tracking. Android phones, for instance, were found collecting location data from cell towers even when users had location services turned off.
Even when it's off.
Yes, making it possible to pinpoint someone down to a specific building. And experts say anonymizing that kind of data is basically impossible. Then you have health apps sharing private info without clear permission, selling it off.
Okay.
And facial recognition is huge now. Facebook systems learn to identify not just faces, but activities, interests, mood, gaze, clothing, gait, all from photos you upload.
It's learning how I walk from a picture.
The potential is there. And then there's the race to the spoken word, voice data. Companies like Microsoft literally set up mock apartments to record volunteers talking just to train their AI. Amazon's Alexa is constantly capturing and storing words.
We all kind of know that one, I guess.
But think about toys like My Friend Kayla. This doll recorded kids' conversations, uploaded them, could access the phone's contacts, camera.
That's incredibly disturbing for a child's toy.
Right. Zuboff's concern is that kids growing up with this learn that there are no boundaries between self and market. Everything is potentially data to be captured.
This link between just collecting masses of data and then actually modifying behavior,
Yeah.
it feels like the really scary part. Like we're not just being watched, but actively, subtly nudged.
That's the core of it, yes. The behavioral surplus isn't just for predicting anymore. It's for actuation, for intervening to shape what you do. Remember that Facebook experiment from 2014, the emotional contagion one?
Yeah, where they tweaked people's news feeds to see if it could make them happier or sadder. That caused a huge backlash.
Exactly. Because it raised the obvious question. If Facebook can tweak emotions and make us vote, what else can it do? It showed the potential for direct manipulation.
Right. And you mentioned Pokemon Go earlier. The mobile game that had everyone walking around was that actuation too.
Zuboff argues it was a brilliant, large-scale demonstration of achieving economies of action.
Economies of action.
Yeah, think about it. The game, which came out of Google's incubator, wasn't just fun. It was directing millions of individual players to specific physical locations in the real-world locations that could be sponsored, like McDonald's or Starbucks. It wasn't just showing an ad. It was literally moving bodies to places for commercial benefit.
Wow, I never thought of it quite like that. Turning gameplay into directed foot traffic.
Precisely. And this points to a whole new type of power. Zuboff calls it instrumentarian power.
Instrumentarian, like playing people as instruments.
Sort of. The idea is it aims for certainty without terror. It's different from old-school totalitarianism that used violence to control bodies. This is more subtle. It tries to organize, herd, and tune society towards predictable, guaranteed outcomes. It kind of separates your subjective experience, your feeling of free will, from your actual observable, modifiable behavior, almost like you're exiled from your own actions.
That sounds deeply philosophical, but also really practical in a scary way.
It is. And Zuboff connects it back to the ideas of B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist psychologist.
Skinner from Psych 101, the rats and levers guy.
The very same. In his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which was super controversial back in the 70s, Skinner argued for creating a technology of behavior. He thought concepts like free will and dignity were illusions holding back progress, and that society should be engineered through pervasive behavioral control.
That sounds dystopian.
It was widely criticized, yeah. Thinkers like Noam Chomsky tore into it. But Zuboff's point is that the technology to potentially enact something like Skinner's vision on a mass scale, well, it exists now.
So where are we seeing this instrumentarian power actually being used today, maybe outside of just trying to sell us stuff?
Well, think about predictive policing. Companies like Palantir analyze data to identify potential gang members or predict where violence might occur. The goal is automation, tuning society for guaranteed social outcomes, not just market ones.
Right, trying to predict crime before it happens.
Exactly. And then the really stark example maybe is China's social credit system.
Ah, yes. We hear a lot about that.
It's designed to automate social control through tuning, herding, and conditioning. People get scored, and low scores can lead to real consequences, being blacklisted from buying plane tickets, trains, even reports of friends cutting ties to protect their own scores.
That's intense social engineering.
It is, and it's not just authoritarian states. Mark Zuckerberg has talked about Facebook becoming like a new global church, building social infrastructure and using AI to spot risks that nobody would have flagged. It's a vision of global-scale social tuning, even if framed more benignly.
It's just unsettling, constantly being monitored, potentially shaped. What does this do to us as people, as a society? What are the real human costs here?
The costs are potentially huge. This vision of an instrumentarian society, Zuboff warns, could lead to a kind of human simulation of machine learning systems, a confluent hive mind.
A hive mind, like we lose our individuality.
In a sense, yes, or at least the space for it shrinks dramatically, and we're already seeing signs of what she calls psychic numbing.
Psychic numbing.
Yeah, like we've become desensitized. Practices that would have seemed like nightmares just a few decades ago, companies knowing our private thoughts, feelings, predicting our every move, it's starting to feel normal, almost inevitable. We just kind of shrug.
That's true. It's hard to maintain outrage. And what about kids? Younger people growing up completely immersed in this.
That's a huge concern. Sean Parker, who was involved early on with Facebook, famously admitted they intentionally designed it to give dopamine hits, to exploit psychological vulnerabilities to keep people glued to the hive.
Creating addiction, basically.
Essentially, yes. And I think many of us feel that pull, don't we?
Yeah.
Beyond that, study after study shows how the constant social comparison on platforms like Facebook leads to more envy, lower self-esteem, declines in well-being, especially among young adults. It's a measurable negative impact.
So less happiness, more anxiety.
And then there's this deeper loss, the erosion of what Zuboff calls sanctuary. She draws on the sociologist Irving Goffman, who talked about the importance of backstage spaces.
Backstage, like private spaces.
Exactly. Places where we can drop the mask, be imperfect, experiment, be truly ourselves without judgment or performance pressure. It's essential for psychological health, for creativity, for just being human. But surveillance capitalism invades that backstage.
There's nowhere left to hide.
It feels like that sometimes. Zuboff has this incredibly powerful line. If you've got nothing to hide, you are nothing.
Wow. Say that again.
If you've got nothing to hide, you are nothing. Her point is that the very core of selfhood requires this inviolable private refuge, and that refuge is precisely what's under assault.
This really feels like it goes beyond individual psychology. It sounds like a fundamental challenge to bigger structures, like democracy itself.
It absolutely is. Zuboff argues it leads to a privatization of the division of learning. Think about the key questions in any society. Who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides?
Right. Knowledge is power.
Exactly. Surveillance capitalism concentrates that knowledge and therefore power and freedom within the companies themselves. They know more about us than we know about ourselves or than our governments know. And they use that advantage to protect their operations, not necessarily our interests.
And does this lead to weirder outcomes?
It leads to what she calls radical indifference. The algorithms are just optimizing for engagement, for clicks, for profit. They don't have values, which is how you get truly disturbing things, like major brand ads showing up next to hateful content, Jew hater searches, things like that on Google or Facebook. The system is indifferent to the meaning or morality, only to the metrics.
That's deeply troubling.
And politically, we're seeing what some call a democratic recession. Surveys in many countries show declining faith in representative democracy. Worryingly, large numbers of people, especially younger people, say things like rule by experts or even rule by a strong leader would be a good way to run the country.
People losing faith in the democratic process itself.
It seems that way, which connects to what Zuboff sees as the most fundamental right under threat, what she calls the right to the future tense.
The right to the future tense. What does that mean?
It's our basic human ability to imagine a future, to set intentions, to make promises, to construct our own lives going forward, to have agency. If your behavior is constantly being predicted, nudged, and shaped by hidden forces for their profit, how much are you really the author of your own future? That core capacity, the will to will, she calls it, is undermined.
So it chips away at our very sense of agency, our ability to choose our own path.
That's the argument. And things like those endless digital agreements, the terms and conditions, she calls them uncontracts. They aren't real agreements between equals. They impose unilateral power, bypass genuine human promises, and reflect that same radical indifference to our actual needs and autonomy.
Okay, this is heavy stuff. It feels so massive, so entrenched. After laying all this out, what can we actually do? Is this just the inevitable future we have to live with? It can feel pretty overwhelming.
It can feel overwhelming, definitely. But Zuboff is really clear on this. Technological inevitability does not exist. That's a crucial message.
It's not inevitable.
No, these are systems made by humans, driven by specific economic choices. And what humans make, humans can unmake, or at least remake. She uses this great analogy of the Berlin Wall.
Okay.
Says, yes, there were individual acts of resistance, people digging tunnels under the wall. That's important, like us using ad blockers or VPNs. But the tunnels alone didn't bring the wall down.
Right. It was a bigger political shift.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What was needed were synthetic declarations, collective democratic action, demanding change at a systemic level. That's what ultimately dismantled that structure of illegitimate power.
So we need more than just individual fixes. We need collective action, political action.
That's the core message. It means pushing for real, strong data privacy laws like Europe's GDPR, maybe even stronger. It could mean supporting alternatives, nonprofit platforms, publicly owned digital infrastructure. Thinking about data ownership differently, it requires us, as she says, to rekindle the sense of outrage and loss.
To actually get angry about what's being taken.
Yes. To feel the loss of our sovereignty over one's own life and authorship of one's own experience, to translate that feeling into demanding systemic change, not just tweaking our privacy settings.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has really unpacked how this specific economic logic, surveillance capitalism, works. How it takes our behavior as raw material, predicts what we'll do, and increasingly tries to shape what we do, all for someone else's profit. We've traced its roots, seen how it spreads, and faced its, well, pretty profound implications for us as individuals, for our privacy, our freedom, and maybe even for democracy.
Indeed. And it leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? The digital future is here. It's not going away. But what kind of future will it be? Will we demand a human future first, one where technology serves human values and goals? Or will we drift into a future where we're constantly being tuned, herded, and conditioned because it guarantees profits and predictable outcomes for a few?
That's the challenge.
It really is. The core task now is to demand that this powerful digital capitalism serves people, serves society, rather than just exploiting us as data sources. It's about fighting for some friction, as Zuboff puts it, slowing down these smooth and visible flows of coercion. It's about refusing to just hand over our future to this illegitimate power, making sure the digital world empowers you, not just extracts value from you.